All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to TNP's webinar, What is the Role of the Board in Times of Crisis? Thank you all for joining us today. For those of you who are working from organizations that provide essential services, thank you for continuing your most important work. We truly appreciate you joining us today. And for those of us who are kind of on the back burner of things, thank you again for joining us. I know we're all adjusting to how to work around COVID-19, and we truly appreciate your partnership in figuring things out. TNP is committed to continuing our work to building your capacity so that you can make positive impact in your communities. And we remain your partner in trying to figure things out. So whether you're looking for additional webinar topics or if you're looking for custom support projects in helping you figure out how to structure your organization going forward, let us know how we can help you. You can always reach us at info@tnpsocal.org. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Christina Krishma. I'm the program manager for the nonprofit partnerships. So really proud to be bringing you educational programs that meet your needs. And I wanted to thank our sponsors for these webinars, the Josephine S. Gumbiner Foundation, as well as the Port of Long Beach, for sponsoring these and making it possible for the nonprofit partnership to provide these for free to all of you. So if you've missed any of our prior webinars or information, everything can be accessed on our website at tnpsocal.org. And all of the information and video links for this webinar will be sent directly to anyone who is registered. So thank you again. I want to mention too that if anybody is interested in our upcoming events, we do have our Fund Developers Affinity Group and our Volunteer Managers Affinity Group happening tomorrow. So 9 a.m. for Fund Developers, 2 p.m. for Volunteer Managers. And we also have our HR check-in. Tomorrow's focus will be on performance management of your remote teams. And those happen every Friday at 11 a.m. with Ann Laguza of the Works Consulting. So still working to kind of meet your needs. Let us know what you need going forward. And we're really appreciative of your continued partnership with us. So without further ado, I want to introduce Patty Oertel with the Oertel Group. She holds over 40 years in nonprofit management and guidance. We're really appreciative of her being here today. She actually ran Center for Nonprofit Management for quite a few years. She has taught at the UCLA Anderson's Graduate School of Management, as well as Cal State University Northridge. And we're very appreciative to have you here today, Patty, to share your knowledge and expertise with us. Just a reminder, if anybody does have questions, please post them up in the Q&A box. We will try to get to your questions throughout the webinar or follow up with resources afterwards. So without further ado, Patty, off to you.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you all for participating in today's session. Christina's going to monitor the chat function and raise your questions to me as we go through this content. We do want to make this as interactive as possible and still cover kind of some of the content that we thought might be useful to all of you. I'm going to kind of just describe the goals for today's session. Sorry. So by the end of today's webinar, no later than 3:30, we hope that all of you have sort of an understanding of how the crisis is impacting all nonprofit organizations. It's just impacting groups differently. We're going to explore options for how a nonprofit board of directors can continue its important oversight role and other functions without meeting in person. Discuss items that are specific to board committees, such as human resources, investment, and fundraising. And then really review questions that you have about boards given your particular circumstances. So those are kind of our goals. And I will say that while I don't think any of us have experienced anything close to COVID-19, I was the executive director at the Center for Nonprofit Management for two crises that faced our county. One was the Rodney King riots of 1992 and how that impacted staff in the organizations that we worked with. And then also the Northridge earthquake, which impacted for a short period of time, people's ability to come to the office and to navigate freeways, which were not usable and things. So again, I have very limited, but still experience with these kind of crises. So when I do a webinar, I will usually start with sort of some of my thoughts on the subject. And then I very much want to turn it over to all of you to get kind of your questions and your perspective. We are going to have you use the written chat function, and Christine will monitor that. And as she said, if we look back on those questions at the end of today and we didn't answer them, then we will get that information out to you. And as Christina also said, you can contact Christina with additional questions that occur to you later, or the very last slide has my email address, and you are welcome to email me with any questions that you have. I kind of love answering questions. It's a carryover from my Center for Nonprofit Management days when we had a manager's helpline. So, all right. Christina, can you put up the first poll, the one about whether or not they have yet conducted a board meeting? So it's a simple question. Has your organization yet conducted a board meeting since the outbreak, and recommendation to work from home?
I'm just going to give it a few more seconds. We have over 100 people in the webinar right now, and about half of you have voted. So if you see that poll up on your screen, you can vote either very simple yes or no, and maybe another 15 seconds or so before I'll close it out and share the results.
Right. Thanks, Christina. So again, as a sample, about 65% of you have already conducted a board meeting. And so we'll, again, want you to weigh in with your experiences via the written chat function. And 35% of you have not. And so we'll also want to know what your questions are about maybe how to structure a board meeting and what's permissible and not permissible. So again, it just gives us a feel for who's on the call and the rough percentages. So I appreciate your doing that. Christine, if you can close out this poll and then put up the next one. We also want to get a feel for who's in the room from the standpoint of kind of how this crisis is related to your mission, meaning, you know, are you having a service that there's almost like increased demand for because you provide such an essential urgent service, or one that's needed more because of the specifics of this crisis? Or are you kind of neutral demand? It's kind of about the same as it was pre-COVID-19. Is it reduced demand? Are your services maybe less being used or less able to be used, like a museum? And that you're really in a position where you need to reframe how your services are being accomplished, such as a theater with an online performance.
So we're getting responses coming in, about a third of you so far. I'm going to leave it open for another 20 seconds or so. If you want to take a look at your screen, the poll question is up on your screen right now.
So you're now able to see the poll results, and really the largest percentage is that you're really needing to look at how to reframe your service delivery. That is interesting. I was not necessarily expecting that to be the highest percentage. We can try to address some of that in today's session as it relates to the board, but Christina, it may be almost as a topic for another webinar of really what is at stake when you have to just completely revise your service delivery model because it otherwise doesn't make sense. So, okay. This just gives me a feel for who's in the room. Any questions that anyone has from the chat function that just relate to kind of this division of representation of people within the webinar?
Not seeing anything just yet.
Okay, I'm going to then stop sharing on this so that we can move to kind of more of the content that's relevant to the board. Okay. So, just with respect to boards, and there may be some people on this call that are from out of state. One of my colleagues in Nevada recommended it to all of her clients. So this is really specific to California. And it is one of those things that a lot of state law is what impacts how a board of directors can operate. And these are things that just otherwise don't come up that much. And so I wanted just to start out with, when you have a board meeting, what is permissible? So for California nonprofit organizations, it is permissible to conduct meetings telephonically or via video conference. The key factor is that all board members must be able to hear each other. And when there's a law, I like to kind of then explain sort of what is the basis of that. And both the US government and the California government just believes that board members will be more effective if they can hear each other, or in the case of individuals that are deaf, if there is simultaneous transition. And so that's why they want it to be something where people can engage and hear each other's opinions, because they feel that the best decisions, the best policies will be made under that format. And so if you either don't have a meeting or you didn't meet quorum and there's a motion, that motion then has to carry by unanimous written consent for it to be valid. Again, it's the law is written that way because they feel that it will be best if there is rigorous dialogue of the issues. The reason that they have this kind of clause about unanimous written consent is really from the standpoint that they believe that that motion would have carried that way, even if people were discussing, because it was passed by 100% of the board members. Just a couple of things on just sort of the structure of board meetings that I found from the nonprofit, like the national group, like the Alliance for Nonprofit Management, and some of the other board meetings I've been part of as on either Zoom or Skype or some other electronic device, is it can be challenging to know who's going to speak. And I have found when like 90% of the people are on Zoom or Skype, and a board member that's just on the phone just starts talking, that board member gets the floor, or whatever analogy you want to make to the floor in a Zoom call. Versus if you were in a live meeting, people might raise their hands, or you might nod or something that you want to say something. And so organizations really have to kind of work on what is their protocol for who's going to be called on in what sequence, either the people on the phone or the people that can raise their hand on a Zoom or Skype function. It's just sort of a proper etiquette and proper honoring of your values. So do you have any questions that you could put into the written chat function based on conducting a board meeting virtually? Christina, do you see any questions that are in that category?
Actually, we did have a question, if you can explain the last point again.
Okay, so if you're going to have a live meeting, be in person or via an electronic system like this, Skype or Zoom, or even if everyone was on the phone telephonically, then any actions that you agree to are legal, provided you had met a quorum. But if you did not meet quorum, or you want to vote on something without holding a meeting, then the only way that it is permissible is if 100% of the board votes in favor of that. And then the other point that I was making is really, it's a courtesy issue. It's, with everyone participating via Zoom, although I guess we actually have this in this circumstance too, because some people are calling in via phone versus being part of the electronic system of Zoom, where people can raise their hands or write their chat features. And so you just need to develop some sort of a protocol for who gets called on, so that there isn't a priority set solely for the people that are doing it electronically versus people on the phone, or vice versa. And the point that I was making is that I've seen in meetings, as well as in heard from other people, that you're going along, as we're doing in this session, where Christina is calling out the chats to me. But if some people are on the phone and they're just talking in whenever they want to raise a point, there's more deference that's given to them. Like their point gets made before the people that were waiting in line get called on. And so, yes, we want to hear from everyone, but we want to have a system in play where everyone can be heard fairly. And also, it's easier if people are participating via the Zoom or Skype to know who raised the question. So you can say, Alberta, that's a really good question. Let me respond to it. But if it's just phone numbers and you don't know who's associated with that phone number, they're just this like disembodied voice coming into the room. But I have just found, for whatever reason, those voices coming into the call get addressed immediately and carry more weight. And so I just have a very strong kind of generic democratic value that everyone's voice should be treated equally. And so you may just set a ground rule of, if the people on the phone could say, this is Janet, I would like to say something, then the person navigating the meeting, the committee chair or the board chair, can say, yes, Janet, we're going to first hear from Paul and Debbie, and then I'll call on you. So just that there's a cue for it, and that it's not the device you're using that's getting the priority. I hope that makes sense now.
We do have a couple of questions that have come up on this point, so I just want to make sure that we get those out of the way first. On unanimous consent, is that only if you don't have a quorum or for any motion?
Only if, well, so it's two cases. If you have quorum at a live meeting, live in this case counts in person, Skype, Zoom, or 100% electronic phone call, or some mixture of those. Once you have quorum, then the people in that room, as long as the majority of them vote for something, then it passes. That would, it's the same rule really as a live in-person meeting. The last bullet point, and I guess maybe I should have separated that, is if you don't have quorum, or if you're choosing to do a vote completely in writing or email, in those circumstances, it has to be a 100% unanimous vote of all currently elected board members to have it be a valid vote. So that's actually a harder thing to achieve than to achieve a electronic meeting with a majority of the board voting on something, and then it's a majority. So once you have quorum, which would be a majority of the board, then the vote carries by a majority of the people in that meeting. So the unanimous written consent is only in the situation where you maybe didn't have quorum in the live meeting, or you chose to do the whole motion via written consent.
Okay, and let's see if well, I think you've answered this, but if you do not have a quorum during an in-person meeting, is it okay to meet that quorum with one other person online?
Yes, as long as they, yes, definitely. A lot of meetings happen that way. It's a mixture of live, in person, and online. The factor would be whether or not people can hear each other. So yes, while it's can sometimes be challenging to have a number of people live in the room and others either phoning in or via Skype or Zoom or something, that is legally permissible in California.
Thank you. Can a board member give their proxy to another board member if they cannot attend so that quorum can be met?
No. They're under California law for nonprofit corporations, kind of the state equivalent of 501c3s. There are not proxies. Again, if you understand the underlying principle of the state and the federal government want rigorous discussion of ideas. And so with a proxy, that person is not privy to the discussion, and he or she may have changed how they would vote. So that's the underlying logic for it. But no, proxies are not permissible. There are nonprofit organizations that are not aware of that part of the law. I have encountered a few organizations over my 40-year plus history of doing this work where they have written proxies into their bylaws, and it's just not permissible for nonprofit organizations. And if any of you want the exact code on that, I can get that for you.
Thank you. One more
question. Because you may have board members push back on it. And so, that I was just trying to validate my credentials. It's that I have had to have these discussions with boards on occasion.
I think we all appreciate the backup resources on that. We'd appreciate that. One more question on this one. For a quorum, would you use your existing bylaws to determine the amount needed for a quorum, regardless of the meeting being face-to-face or virtual?
Yes. Yes, it's the same. It's people. So yeah, it would be the same percentage. It truly isn't whether or not they're live in the room or live on the phone. The critical thing is that they can understand what each other is saying, either through hearing it, or in the case if you have somebody that is deaf, that they can have simultaneous translation. And then that would be permissible as well.
Okay, I think we're pretty good on that one. And I think you may have answered this one, but is the unanimous consent for a quorum, or does the whole board have to agree? I think that's for each vote. I think it's a little bit of a different question, but that's always how it was posed.
Okay. The unanimous written consent only comes in if you need to go outside of the board meeting. So if a quorum's, again, been established, then they can vote, and then it would be a majority of that group voting on it. So it's really wanting to have something pass for which you are not going to meet live, that you need the unanimous written consent, or you need to add that written consent to the 100% of the board members that were at the meeting that voted in favor of it. But quorum wasn't established at that meeting.
Okay, last question I think on this one. Should virtual meetings be specifically written into the bylaws?
I think that it is useful to do that, to say that our board meetings may be conducted in person or via video conferencing, or if no other option is available, by phone, just so that it is clear to everyone that that is an option, and that no one can then kind of challenge it later. It's not absolutely required, because again, these are things that are permissible under the law. But I think always helpful to have the greatest clarity that you can.
I think we're good. Thank you very much for that. It helps us get a foundation for where we're going on this. So thank you, Patty. I think we can move forward.
Great. Yeah, I agree, Christine. I think we kind of got the flow of how this will work, and great. Okay. All right. So these are a few more kind of key questions around the board. So are there, because I'm presuming most of you are executive directors, some of you may also be board members, or other staff within an organization, but kind of from your perspective, what do you think may be questions that you need to bring to your board? So I could see early on from how you described yourselves, those people that are representing organizations where you have to really reshape your mission and your mission service delivery, or even more the latter. Is there a mode in which you can deliver your services that isn't live and in person? That may be something that may be within the power of the executive director to make that decision, but it may be something that you would really want to have board engagement on. So are there kind of just specific situations that you want to bring to your board of directors? Are there kind of vulnerabilities that your organization has that you would like to bring to the board, but you might want to raise in this group first? Are there questions from the press that you'd like to at least sort of work through with the board before answering them? You know, are there ways that you can prevent or mitigate worst case scenarios from occurring? What issues have short-term and long-term implications? So these are some of the things that I thought that if I were still an executive director, that I would want to work through with my board. Not necessarily for them to set policy, but because I would want them as a sounding board, utilize their awareness of the organization, the various backgrounds that they bring to the table, their being active in the discussion will also help them be able to fundraise for the issue, because they can articulate the needs. So are there kind of any of these key questions that you would want people from the chat, from other people on the call to weigh in on, or things that you might want to just pose as a question and get either my perspective or Christina or that of your fellow nonprofit people? While you're maybe adding things to the chat function, I'm going to just kind of give you a couple of maybe how I would approach this, either if I were working with a nonprofit or if I were the executive director. These are some of the key questions actually that Board Source has identified. And, you know, when you look at these, you know, how many of these are things that are really the full board to work on? Or maybe if you had a program committee, maybe that would be something that you would want that committee to look at, or forming a task force. But I think, as I kind of said earlier, I think the board's skill sets and range of knowledge, it's just a helpful asset for you as an executive director to bring into the discussion. And better to do that earlier in the crisis rather than if you have one client who only has quarterly board meetings. And so we're just going to be living in a different world by the time that quarterly board meeting is held. I think it's just, you would want the board engagement sooner. For some of these, you may want to conduct a risk assessment. That's one of the recommendations of Board Source, to sort of look at, you know, what is the best case, medium case, worst case scenario that you're facing. And both for you as an executive director and for your board, and then later for your staff, being able to actually name the worst case scenario can sometimes be really helpful to people. It can help them breathe again. It's like, okay, if that's the worst case scenario, yeah, we wouldn't like it, really not a situation we want, but we've now named it. That makes it easier for us to then look at, well, what's the best case scenario? And what's the medium case scenario? And what would you have to do for each of those scenarios to actually get them implemented? So again, it's just a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, and again, in response to your questions, is really about human behavior. And it's thinking of your board of directors as just humans. They're going through this crisis in their own lives, in their own work, their own families. And so how can they be engaged? And how can you utilize their talents? And how can you help them to see options and for them to use their creativity on solving some of these for the organization? And Board Source also recommends that nonprofits maybe develop a business continuity plan. Again, in the midst of a crisis, that may be a hard thing to create, but maybe after this, you should. And a business continuity plan can say, okay, under these scenarios, this is what we would do. It also means that you've really checked on things like security of documents, security of your electronic files, so that if, again, something like the Northridge earthquake, where it's a building and you may have lost key documents, you have backups for them. So there's a series of things, and Board Source has a resource on business continuity plans that is just available to all of you from their website, or we can get a copy and make it available to you. Christina, from the chat function, were there any questions that we should kind of talk through with the whole group?
I think a few of the questions will actually be covered in some of the latter slides, so we'll hold off for now. Okay,
great. Okay, so this is just sort of a first context for you, and now we're going to go through the subject matter a little bit more on particular committees. And so in your chat function, if you wanted to write any questions related to, like if you had a funding and resource development committee, what would you want to know about what are strategies for addressing that body of work? Or for finance, or for operations and human resources, and marketing, or anything else that I just didn't come up with in one of those committees. But that's sort of how we're going to structure it. We're going to move now to kind of look at each of those committees and what might be questions. So
if I could interject for one
Sure.
moment, if you do have questions, if you could type them in the Q&A box, it's easier to manage them in there. But I do recognize that anybody that is calling in instead of on their desktop, that you only have access to the chat box. So I will try and monitor that as well and pull over those questions. But if it's in the Q&A box, it's just a little bit more manageable on our end.
Thank you, Christina. I so appreciate your conveying that. The Zoom function that I use for my Cal State Northridge class only has the written chat, so that's why it's just so natural for me to say that. But she's absolutely right. On this particular version of Zoom, we have the Q&A, and it really does just work better. So please do utilize that function. I apologize for that, Christina, making your life harder.
Not at all. You're making it easier. You're fielding this. Thank you.
Okay, so a board committee around fundraising. So here were just, a few questions, a few thoughts that I had as to what might be a useful role for this committee. So I could see having your board contact some of your individual donors, but not necessarily for an overt contribution. I think the conversation should start with, how is that donor doing? How has this crisis impacted them, their work, their family? Just engage them as humans. Can I make some version of that statement a lot through this? Because I think we sometimes forget that, because we're looking at our bottom line and, oh my gosh, we're not having revenue coming in, and what are we going to do? But if we think about the human nature of our work with our staff, with our board, with our volunteers, with our donors, with our clients, then we can deepen a relationship. That conversation will be remembered and valued. And then you can move, because it's likely the donor is going to say, well, how are things going at the agency? How is revenue? How dire is this for the organization? What are you doing with the employees? And then the board member can respond to that. And I think in most cases that individual donor, if they have the circumstances to make a contribution, will so do so. But it's not starting with, gosh, we're in dire straits, can you give us money? It's really thinking through, how would you want to be treated if somebody called you, and how to kind of think through the arc of the conversation. And even if you need short-term amounts of money, I think focusing on the long-term relationship is better. And, again, then follow up in a week and talk to that person and see how they're doing again, and then evolve it to fundraising. Just don't start with it being a fundraising pitch. And again, if you have questions or comments or disagreements with me on that, feel free to put it in the Q&A.
We did have a couple of questions. If board members are questioning if this is the right time to reach out for donations and conduct fundraising, is this the right time to do so? So sort of an opinion question on that one.
This is one where I have a personal opinion informed by my 40 plus years of doing this work and working with close to 1,000 nonprofits. is no, I don't think it's the right time to um, start with a fundraising overture, either in the mail or via a phone conversation with an existing donor. Now, it's a little different right now with foundations and even the government, because they understand the predicament that nonprofits are in. And so they have particular funding opportunities right now for nonprofits. So yeah, go for that kind of money. But from a standpoint of individual donors, I think you need to just have the humane conversation first. And then again, the board member needs to be savvy enough in that conversation that depending upon how that conversation goes, yes, that person could add to the conversation that, oh, and I do just kind of want to let you know how our organization's doing right now. And yes, we're doing really great on this front and this front, but the demand for our services has gone up so high, we really don't have the resources. So, we just want to convey that to you. And yes, if you were in a position to make a contribution, we would greatly appreciate it. So it's a little bit more of a soft sell than could you write a check for $1,000? I'm not really fond of that kind of fundraising anyway, because I want the long-term relationship. But this is one where I have an opinion, but there are definitely other opinions out there about how to make the most of this thing. And there are certainly appeals that are going out. I get a lot of them in my email box. So it's something that you as an executive director will need to weigh and board members will need to weigh. But I think the approach that I'm describing is one that will deepen the relationship for the longest period of time. So it's, do you want short-term success or long-term relationships?
Somewhat related to this, and I don't know if this will get too deep into the weeds, but we have a few questions that are related to this. If they have board members who are not typically as engaged as they would want them to be, and I'm softening some of the language, and but they've asked repeatedly, but they're still even not engaging or even contributing to the organization at this time. How do you advise handling this situation, or kind of pulling them into the fold?
Okay. So again, given that I'm presuming that most people on this call are going to be executive directors, I think that is not something for the executive director to address. I think the executive director needs to talk to the board chair or the chair of like a board development committee, and just talk to those people about who the board members that are in that category. And then, and again, this would have been my response pre-COVID-19 or the circumstances of today. Because it will be the executive director that will notice when a board member is lapsing in their responsibilities or their contributions or their other commitments. And so it's certainly appropriate for the executive director to raise that question to a board chair, other officers, or to a chair of a board development committee. But then it works so much better if it can be a conversation board member to board member. That's peer-to-peer. And I don't think it's ever comfortable for an executive director to have that conversation, but you're also then having the conversation with a member of what is your collective boss. And so again, it's just not kind of the right role. It's not easy to do. But the board chairs, other officers, the chair of the board development committee may be equally uncomfortable with how to have that conversation. And so you need to kind of work through with them how to have that conversation. Really, what does the agenda look like? How do you structure it? How do you frame it? How do you make that person still feel good about everything that they have already contributed to the organization? Is it more of a matter of it's just not the right time in their lives to be on this group, but that they still support the organization? Then board chair, whomever, can say to that person, you know, gosh, we so appreciate everything you've done, but given everything that's going on right now, this sounds like it's not the right time for you to be on the board. Would it work for you to resign from the board, and then when your circumstances change, come back to us? And, you know, at that point, if we have space on the board, then we'll reelect you to the board. And we'll certainly still keep you on all of our mailing lists and our newsletters so that you know what we're doing. And we'll check in with you periodically. So again, think it through as kind of a dialogue, and also think it through as how, if you were in that person's spot, you would want that conversation to go. So again, it's a little bit of having a script, a little bit of practice for the board members, and really coming at this from the standpoint of empathy, no matter how much the person has not come through when they said they would come through. And you might have a little bit of anger or upset in you. But the more that you can, the board member to board members can have the conversation, the better it will be. Other questions?
Just one, a very basic, is the board committee considered an actual extension of the board?
Oh, yes, a board committee is considered kind of an extension of the board from the standpoint of their focus. And I realized I was using the term both board committee generically and board committee as a specific type of committee, a committee of the board that is really focused on the board. And not every nonprofit organization has that committee. I really recommend it, because that committee then can be charged with identifying potential new board members and having a structure for that identification in terms of the kinds of connections and histories and skill sets and all of that that you would want on a board, as well as the diversity, so that you're getting a good mix of skill sets and representation and access to corporate dollars and other kinds of things. So if you have like a board development committee, then it's kind of the people on that committee that can be having those challenging conversations with other board members. So I'm sorry if I hadn't made that as clear in my earlier remarks. Now,
thank you. I think we're good. I think we can move on.
Okay, but no committee can make a decision that is really is required to be the full board making a decision. So those things about policies, changing bylaws, adopting a budget, all of that. So, and one last thing, if you have a board member who really is just not attending board meetings, it is helpful to have in your bylaws a provision that if a board member misses 3 consecutive board meetings, that person is no longer a board member. It's a perfectly legal bylaw provision, and then all the board needs to do at that 4th meeting is to say, you know, Tim Brown has now not been present for the last 3 board meetings. By our bylaws, he is no longer a board member. And then you just send a nice letter thanking Tim for all of his service and quoting the language in the bylaws. It frees up the board from having to vote the person off, which in my experience, no matter how poorly that board member is participating, boards are reluctant to let that person or to vote, something about the formality of a vote, to vote that person off. But just having it be that the bylaw provision takes effect by the person not coming, that board members seem to be comfortable with. And there is a way when that is done with graciousness that you can still keep that board member engaged with the organization and as a contributor. Okay. So the next one, converting a fundraising event to a virtual activity. I actually have seen a large number of nonprofits do this already. Liberty Hill converted their big gala party that they have at the Beverly Hilton each year to an online event. And, they reached out to their sponsors to say, this is how we're converting it. We understand that you were sponsoring a live event. Would it still be acceptable for you, for us to keep your sponsorship money? And, but otherwise, if you feel that that is different than your expectations, then what kind of accommodation can we make? And so I'm not certain that they're going to raise quite the same amount of money, but they certainly did it fairly quickly. So kind of at the, the top of the COVID-19 awareness. I don't know that this is something that necessarily needs a board vote, but if you have a board fundraising committee or resource development committee, then I think it is something that you should talk through with them. So I realize that a lot of our questions are board focused and some are just more general about just, again, even from an executive director perspective, switching a fundraising event to a virtual activity. One more comment and I'll see if Christina has any questions. The virtual events that I've seen the switch is there is actually some engagement opportunity. So it could be a movie that everyone's going to watch at the same time, or it could be still be the speaker. Like Eric Holder was going to speak at the Liberty Hill Foundation dinner. And I'm not certain if their switch is that Eric Holder will still do a webinar for everyone. But that I think would, people would still feel that they got that level of engagement. So the virtual activity is a way of still engaging the people that would have been at the event. And until having done this webinar, I wouldn't have thought that you could do one with over 100 people. It's successful, and all of the nonprofit partnerships webinars have been this size or even larger. So again, it is a format that can be engaging, and you can have people break into little small chat rooms, so it could be as if they were tables at an event, and let them have their little cocktail hour and talk, and then have the speakers. So there might be creative ways to do that transition. Questions on that, Christina?
One just follow-up question, because you recommended that they have the board chair speak to someone if they're reluctant to join in. What if the board chair or board leadership is reluctant to address it head on?
Then you talk to the vice chair or the secretary or the treasurer to have that person talk to the board chair. And then between that conversation, because then it's board member to board member, and so it's peer to peer. The executive director always has to remember that they are employed by the board, and so you have to be careful in how much you nudge the board members. But again, if the person that's not performing in the way that the organization needs that person to be performing, then who's the right person to have that conversation? And it may be one of the officers, because they have standing, like the vice president, or the secretary who would notice it because of the minutes, or it could be the chair of the board development committee, or it could be someone who has the best rapport with that individual, someone that person will respect and be open to having that conversation. And it may take a script that you work with that individual on, such as, gosh, we've just noticed that you haven't been available for these meetings, or, haven't made your contribution, and, can you tell us what's going on? And having that person to stress that when it's the board chair, it's just so much more visible to the rest of the board, and it's less motivating to the rest of the board. So again, if the person isn't able to do that, then to fulfill their role, then again, just have them step down, and when their lives change, they can ask to be reinvited, elected to the board. I mean, again, the board can remove a board member. It just is rarely done because they're just too uncomfortable doing it. And there are not leaves of absence. You're either on the board or you're not on the board. So that's what I would recommend. And again, if any of you, need a longer one-to-one conversation on this, I'd be happy to set up a short phone call. And just since some version of this question has come up a lot, to not get in this situation takes having a really good organizational culture and board culture, so that, everything is just set in terms of every board member's on a committee, ideally only one committee. Every committee meets. Committees have charters, they make reports. When there's an energy of either all of the board or nearly all of the board being active in the organization, contributing, and it's just clear to everyone, that just fosters a spirit of accountability. And you get so much more out of your board, and they are that much more supportive of staff. So I have seen this work personally, and it takes time, and it takes the executive director maybe looking at this over, not just a month, but what needs to be done over a span of time. If you, I'll just be honest, when I became the executive director at the Center for Nonprofit Management, from having been the associate director, we had a smaller board than we needed and a slightly less engaged board. And I really worked with that existing board and planted seeds. And, I can't tell the board who to elect, but I can say, gosh, well, let's do a board profile. Who would we want? And then suggest names. And so through that support and cheerleading and offering of suggestions, we got to a board that was considered by all of the foundations to be one of the most active, respected, well-designed boards. So again, I kind of lived that arc and know it's possible. And I've also had many of my clients kind of go through that transition as well. Doesn't mean it's easy and it's not quick, but you can do it if you're really kind of deliberative. So anything else before I go on?
I think we're pretty good. There's several questions that are in the queue, but I believe they'll be handled in the coming slides, because we have upcoming, I believe, finances, communications, and operations HR. So if I'm not getting to your questions right away, I'm not ignoring them. I'm just waiting to see. It'll probably be covered, but I will try to get to them.
Okay, great. So, and I think I probably already covered strategies for connecting with donors. And given that we're all committed to having this session not go past 3:30, I'm going to move on to the board finance slide. And again, if we didn't quite get to all of your questions, we'll figure out how to get you answers after the session. So in terms of finance, and again, as you can kind of tell from my remarks so far, I really do like there to be board committees, because you have a smaller group of people working on something that they are either familiar with or want to have more familiarity with. I encourage people that may want to be a board chair someday to kind of rotate around the committee so that they get all of that knowledge. So I think probably right now, the thing that you would want your finance committee to really be engaged in is, how is this crisis impacting your revenue? Are you having shortfalls? What could be appropriate adjustments? And some of that may be the executive director's prerogative. But in this case, I think using the finance committee, both because of their expertise and as a sounding board and as support if something really is challenging. Like, depending upon the severity of the situation, you may need to let staff go. And that may be emotionally hard. It may be hard on them and their lives. And so to have had that as a sounding board with the finance committee is I just think something that gives you some backup if decisions either have some backlash or, prove more challenging than people initially anticipated. But in looking at those shortfalls, it's also an issue of, is this truly just temporary for the situation? Is it something that maybe that foundation just isn't staffed to get the grant out to you, the grant amount out to you? Are checks not coming in for maybe more of a technical reason? And so look at it of how much of it is really just a circumstance of the moment and will change at the point in time that we're out of the circumstance. Or is it really so significant that it's a large percentage of money and you're not going to get that money back? In which case, then you really do have to make those hard decisions about letting people go. So it's knowing what is the nature of each change in your revenue or each change in your expenses. Are there increased expenses to cover staff working at home? Have you needed to increase secure access to your files? Have you needed to purchase laptops for staff that just really otherwise do not have a personal computer? And so it's like, okay, are there ways that you can cover those increased expenses, if you were to have operating reserves or other kinds of resources to be able to draw on that? Or is it something that, no, you really need to go out and get money to kind of support those things? So is that something that, again, working with the fundraising or resource development committee, you can say, these are where we have shortfalls that we really need to fill, and the time frame for it and the urgency of it, and what are ways that maybe fundraising and resource development could get the revenue in that would cover those. Or if there really isn't strategies for bringing in new revenue to cover those extraordinary expenses, then what else can be done? Is it reducing staff more? Is it, in this case, either both committees, resource development and finance, meeting together and brainstorming along with some of the staff, you may be able to come up with strategies for how some things could be reduced in your budget, additional revenue could be secured, to just see what you can do to make it work. Options are, if you have investment income, you could be drawing down on that investment income. There are additional strategies. There are ones that have perils to them, such as a board member loaning the organization money. I would only recommend that if you as the executive director were really clear that there is revenue that you will be getting in 3 months that's absolutely secured and you can be able to pay that loan back. But these times are probably going to be calling for some really hard decisions. And I don't think the executive director and staff alone should be harboring all of the weight of those being very hard decisions. So again, working with your board committees, and if you don't have board committees, working with your officers can both maybe bring some options that didn't otherwise occur to you forward, and at a minimum, you have touched base with them and you have their support in the decisions that you're going to make. So Christina, questions on this area of finance?
We actually one of the ones that came up with finance is because of COVID. This person said, all of our check signers do not want to come in and sign or have someone come to their house to sign checks. Is there a workaround or a way that we can enforce that? What's the suggestion on that end?
Okay. That's extreme. I would not have anticipated that. Okay. I have a few strategies here, but they will need touching base with your bank. So one strategy is you could just call for a board meeting, you establish quorum at that board meeting, the board votes on new signatories, which can be staff. Part of that provision could be that maybe second staff member to the executive director, like an associate director or finance director, would only sign checks if they were part of the budget. They're just a budgeted set amount in the budget, or you have run it by the treasurer and the board chair. So that may make the board members more comfortable with having a staff member be a second signatory. And when I ran the Center for Nonprofit Management, we had 2 staff as signatories for things that were budgeted items. That, the process of getting a board member signature just isn't necessary in all circumstances. I've had clients where it just takes so much time to drive around and get those signatures. So second one that you would need to check with your bank on is whether or not, I don't know how this could do it. I think my first strategy is the one that would work. This is whether or not they could send an email or a mailed letter with their signature saying, I approve these 10 checks, and I am signing this letter as if I were signing those checks. And if the bank has that person's signature in file, they can compare it. The only thing that hasn't happened is that person's signature being formally affixed to it. Another thing that the board would probably have to vote on is to make a motion that would say, in this time of COVID-19 and the reluctance on the part of board members to sign checks, that we, for this, again, time-specific period, we ask the bank to reduce the requirement to a signal signature on these checks, and that signature would be the executive director's signature. And if the board's somehow reluctant on that, you can say, again, we will run by what those checks are in advance to the treasurer. So the only thing that you're removing from the situation is the physical signature of those board members on the check. So that's the best I can come up with.
We also do have a recommendation from one of our attendees of, if possible, for you to move over to DocuSign. One of the other organizations here has moved over to DocuSign, and it is working for them. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Yes, it's excellent. And a number of groups that I work with have already switched to that. So that is actually just easier. And then you can continue with the same practice of the same board member. So excellent suggestion.
I do want to bring up one here, and I know that we are running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to try to get to these questions. But for one of them, a couple of questions have come up in terms of, and this may be answered here, it may not be, if the shift to online, providing things online is just really impossible for some organizations, and they feel like they are no longer meeting the mission of the organization, or they may not meet the activities as required by their grants. Just a kind of question of how can they address that, either to the public. We have one question, a couple of board members are afraid that it becomes an illegal practice if they are not meeting their stated mission. So they want kind of a mention of that. Or, just a question of how really flexible do we think grants, especially government grants, will be if we have had to shift things and aren't able to meet those particular guidelines. And I'm not sure if you're able to address any of that, but I did want to ask the question.
Okay, so it's kind of got 3 parts to it. So one is, I think it's useful for all of you to have that conversation with your funding sources, be they government, foundation, corporate funders, others, and to just say, this is the circumstance we're in. You know, the nature of our program is something that you can only be done live, and the people are not able to come, and we're not able to staff it. Is there an accommodation that's a short-term accommodation that we kind of place the work on hold until such time as we are back to, you know, a new normal? And, you know, whatever that might be, is it 3 months, is it 5 months? And just have an honest conversation with the funder to say, what is reasonable in this circumstance? I think you will find certainly most foundation funders to be very open to that, because all you're doing is putting a pause into the project. In the case of the governmental funders, I'm hoping they will be that way. I just don't have that same kind of current familiarity with the government funders. But I think if you really think that there is just not an option, then yes, put a pause. In each of those conversations, I'll also say, but we have staff, and we want those staff to still be you know, receiving their salaries, and we can't do that without that grant money. I think that's fair to convey to those funding sources. And I'm hoping in some, if not all cases, they will say, yes, we understand that. If there are things that you could do, like writing curriculum or designing policies and procedures, or things that the organization may have wanted to do, but you are always too busy with your mission related work, then that's, you know, still something positive and beneficial that's occurring during that time frame. So but I think it's first having those discussions, and then it's having that same discussion with the board. And I think embedded, Christine, in what you said is also a question that groups may need to really face, which is this just a short-term time frame, or is it going to be so catastrophic to our work that we may not be able to come back from, in which case making that decision to close now is really better. It's better because your employees then can seek unemployment. They are aware of what's happening. You can sell off the assets of the organization. You can transfer things to another organization. You can choose this moment to approach another organization to, you know, merge with them. So, yeah, I mean, if you really see that long-term this is challenging, then those are the kinds of questions you need to address, maybe with your management team first, and then with the board. And I would go through committees and officers before bringing it to the full board. I just would want to have kind of some talking out. But first, before you think it's dire, talk to your funding sources and any major donors. Okay.
I think we can move forward.
Okay, so just on operations, and not every board has an operations committee or a human resources committee. I don't think it has I don't always recommend it. But if you have one, then you may need to look at your human resources policies or personnel policies to see if there are changes that need to just be made to those policies, such as providing people to work from home. And then just on then an implementation level, you know, what does a timesheet look like? What are you holding your staff members to in terms of accountability if they're working at home? Do they need to check in each day? Do they need to give you some sort of a report on what they're doing? So you may want to look at your personnel and human resources policies to just see if there's anything so strict in that you would really need to change it right now. Again, I think there's going to be a lot of flexibility around. I don't know that any staff member is going to hold you to the letter of what's in the personnel policy, nor would a judge. mitigating a lawsuit, but you might want to look at it and just see if there can be a short-term policy to it. And you know, this is really more operational than a board committee, but, you know, is there a need to adjust kind of supervision? You know, who's supervising who, what decisions get made by who, how does communication flow, so that if there's a staff member reporting to a manager, is that manager reporting things up to the executive director, so that even with everyone working remotely, everyone is still in the loop.
We do have a related question there, and one of the questions was, how are we going to function if our executive director or key staff member gets the virus?
Very good question. So one of the things that I encourage all organizations to have is a sustainability plan, and to have part of that be succession planning. I also find if it's framed as sustainability, then it's much easier to get the succession plan written. And so then it doesn't seem like it's just personal about wanting a plan to get rid of the executive director. But in that sustainability plan, it should be that if the executive director you know, has an accident, or you know, dies, or is otherwise not available to do the job, then who is deemed to be the next in command? And if you have an associate director, then that's a logical position. But if you don't have, if you're small enough and you don't have an associate director, then you may want to make the choice of, well, then it will be the manager for programs that will be the acting executive director. And if you have that in place, then you would also want to have that person be on the bank's signatory list, but you would only utilize that person under this circumstance, unless you wanted to have that be a second staff signatory. But yes, thinking through any of the kind of the, not expression I really like, but chain of command. So, you know, what happens if the executive director is not able to work because of COVID-19? What happens to the next in command? And depending upon the size of the organization, you might want to go down to the third level of who would take over for the second in command if that person proves not able to take to run the organization. So that it's not, it's a decision that's been thought through, and that the people are prepared for that, and that it's not just a whim that the board chair comes in and says, well, gosh, James is no longer able to be the executive director. Charles, you take over. You know, it should just be a thought through process. And part of my sustainability practices are also to have manuals, so that written manuals online and in paper, so that it is easy for the person taking over for the executive director to know what those roles and responsibilities are, where files are, what the timing is of things, and who to contact, you know, kind of immediately. And that would be foundations, corporations, governmental funding sources, and large donors. You don't want any of them learning about it in the paper or via, you know, a side conversation. But having all of that written down is just much easier on an organization than having to create those policies in a crisis. Anything else, Christina?
I think that's it on that one. If we can get through the next slide, and then we'll do the wrap-up questions, because we do have a few pertinent ones.
Okay. So just lastly on this one, communications. You know, not, again, every organization has a marketing and communications committee, but if you have one, then it's really defining what's the board role in that versus the staff role. And, but I could see during this particular crisis that you may want to talk, if you don't have a committee, you may want to talk with board leadership about what information should be shared publicly about the organization, how it's currently transitioning its services, what it is personally going through, you know, just so that, again, it's, I think it's always better to share information when you can control it, rather than waiting until something becomes news and it's then out of your control. Were there any specific questions on communications?
No.
Okay. Then in our limited time, kind of what else is on your minds? And Christina, what are other questions that were posed to you?
One that I really think is great to address here is what skill sets would be best practice for a crisis or risk management committee or plan?
So there are actually corporate officers who have the title of risk management. But I think that the skill set would be actually be good at writing policies, because a lot of this is just step-by-step stuff. But I would want kind of a range of people that, have some familiarity with fundraising, some familiarity with running an organization, different perspectives, because the talking that through is kind of what helps you to know that you've identified the range of strategies. Because then once you have confidence that you've identified the range of strategies, it's easier to prioritize which one you want. I think we're all a little anxious right now because we don't really know how to handle this. And oh gosh, this is my first thought, but is it the best thought? Do I have the range of thinking? And in some cases, it's also just reaching out to others as to what would they think. And this could be a great way of actually talking to a donor and saying, you have this position of risk management in your organization. Could we just kind of, ask you some questions about it, because we'd like to know how to do that. So you're engaging them for their expertise. People love that. That really creates loyalty. So yeah, and then writing good, clear policies and getting down to the procedural level with those policies is also a skill set, probably better, more common in larger for-profit firms than in nonprofits. But it's actually something that I do a lot of, is writing policies for organizations. So it's also about writing them clearly and having some resources where you can research what other nonprofits have written for that policy, so that, again, you don't always have to start from scratch in doing things. So Christina, do you think that answered the question?
I think so. Yes.
Okay.
I do. Let's see. This was one that is actually in your wheelhouse. So for those of you that are listening, Patty will be conducting our bylaws training later this year. So if you're interested in revisiting or writing your bylaws, she's a great person to ask. But this one is specifically for bylaws. They say there are bylaws specify we are to hold an annual meeting with membership at the end of our fiscal year in July. And we are looking ahead to the potential of either not being able to meet during that time due to COVID, or perhaps having the need to meet virtually. Are there any existing guidelines in, or do they have to have these guidelines in their bylaws, or do they have to adjust their bylaws around something like this?
Good question. One, I never like that kind of precision in bylaws, because, again, circumstances can come up that just make it impossible for you to achieve that. So, more frame it that, yes, we will have an annual meeting and we will alert all members as to the date and location of the meeting. You might want to need to check with an attorney on this, but I think that these circumstances, if you send to all members saying, yes, we would still like to have the member meeting at that time, and if we are through this crisis in a way that we can have a live meeting on that date, we will do that. Otherwise, we have already thought through the contingency plan of having the meeting be via webinar, and we are developing our skill sets in how to do that and how that to be an engaging process. We just wanted to give you a heads up that this is how we're thinking about it. So yes, it wouldn't be exactly consistent with the bylaws, but you've done the best for what you can with abiding by what are the current regulations for having large meetings. So I think that should be sufficient, but you would want to talk with your board chair and maybe have the board just vote on that to say, you know, we're suspending this bylaw provision because it's not possible to do it. And this is how we have adjusted it to meet the intent of it without the actual premise for which we legally could not hold that meeting. And then post-COVID, really look at your bylaws and try to remove the things that are so precise that it makes them possible. And there are more than one school of thoughts on bylaws, but I think, and the attorneys I work with are ones that would say, you know, just don't be that precise with something in the bylaws because it doesn't give you flexibility when you need it.
There's maybe one more question just to kind of clear up something. There was a question, can you give a reference for the rule that all electronic votes must be unanimous?
Oh, okay. I didn't say that all electronic votes have to be unanimous of the board. If you have a board meeting in which you have quorum, then it's just a majority of the quorum that would pass it, unless you have bylaw provisions that would say something else. It is if you are not holding a meeting, but you need a vote. And so let's say you're sending an email out to everyone for them to vote. That needs to be 100%. And I cannot give you that provision off the top of my head. But if you, and this will be a good segue to this, if you email me at my email address, then I am happy to find you that part of code.
And I know we're wrapping up here on time. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Patty, for sharing this information with us. There were a few more questions in the Q&A box, but quite a few of them were addressing fundraising at this time, communications at this time, financial adjustments, and a lot of that information was addressed in the prior webinars. So I just wanted to kind of mention again that if you missed any of TNP's webinars that we've held so far, you can access them and view them on TNP's website at tnpsocal.org. We held ones on moving your team to work remotely, fundraising during this time, scenario planning, so financial adjustments and scenario planning, fundraising in particular, so what strategies you can be looking at conducting right now and in the near future. And then we also looked at communication tactics and how best to reach out to your stakeholders, including donors during that time. So a lot of your questions that popped up in there related to that can probably be answered within those webinars. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those. And if there's any others that we didn't quite get to, I will look to follow up with you directly. I think I sent some private messages in that field. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you again to Patty Oertel of the Oertel Group for sharing your expertise. Thank you to the Josephine S. Gumbiner Foundation, as well as the Port of Long Beach for sponsoring these webinars and enabling TNP to provide this information to you free of charge. We are really looking to continue to provide as much information as possible pertinent to what you need. I think one of the things that came out of this is we're probably going to be looking at doing a board 101 session. So if we have any existing board members on there, I think we'll be planning that pretty soon and getting that out to everybody in a very soon manner and as one of our workshop series. So if I think that's it. Patty, any last minute?
No, but thank you, Christina, for all of your support and everyone from the Nonprofit Partnership, and certainly in terms of helping me to manage this session. So thank you very much too.
Well,
and thank you all for your participation and just best wishes for everything in these times.
Everybody stay safe. Stay dry if you can. It's pouring over here. And I just want to say too that if you do have any of those questions about managing performance expectations of your team or just HR related questions, a couple of them popped up today. We do hold our regular HR check-in call every Friday at 11 a.m. with Ann Laguza of the Works Consulting. So if you're interested in signing up for that, go to tnpsocal.org in our calendar. You can click there, register. Those are free as well. So I'll see some of you tomorrow We also have that Fund Development Affinity Group at 9 a.m. tomorrow and Volunteer Managers Affinity Group at 2 o'clock tomorrow. So we got a packed Friday. But thank you again, Patty. This was fantastic. Appreciate your support. You're a wonderful affiliate of ours. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today. We look forward to seeing you again online and in the future in real life. Everybody be safe and take care.
Take care, everybody.